Welcome to the Motogp Xtra podcast.
Yes, it is time. We are back for season 3 of the Motogp Xtra podcast. And to be fair, season 2024 is looking very interesting in all three classes. We have a lot to discuss, so we're going to jump straight into Moto 3. Now, Moto 3 and Moto 2 have a new tyre supplier that we'll cover more in Moto 2 as well later. But Rhys going to throw straight over to you early. What do you expect for the season of the lower categories now that we have Pirelli? We've seen testing and we've seen our first race. Is it a good or bad change? How do you think it's going to play out for the season?
Well, I don't know about whether it's a good or a bad change. It's always nice to see change in these classes. I mean, if you remember back to a few years ago, the Trial's been introduced into Moto 2. That shook things up. Moto 2 especially, it's good for because it's a bit of a stale class, whereas Moto 3, you could have them going around on like road tyres and they'd still make the race interesting. You know what I mean? Like, it's so yeah. I'm not too sure whether it's a good or a bad change, but nice to see some variety. But in terms of what I expect to see happening over the season, I expect these first few rounds, especially, to kind of be a bit more of a lottery, a bit more random, especially in Moto 2. But I suppose start off talking about Moto 3. Really, I expect like some riders to maybe have a bit of an edge initially, maybe some struggling a little bit more, but generally be a bit more shaken up, and some you might get a surprise result or two. But I think once you've got to sort of Jerez, Le Mans, Mugello time, there might have been some tests, there's more data. I think they'll start to sort of get sorted, and you'll start to see more of the same people at the front, and the good teams like that you've got, like your IOs and you might VDSs of the world, and these kind of teams, the top teams that maybe have struggled a little bit this first weekend, or we've had some upsets with in some of the categories as well, with some riders you didn't expect to see up there. I think we'll get it level out a little bit more as we approach that halfway point of the season, whereas I think the data will kind of balance. They'll kind of have a rough idea of what to do setup-wise and how to manage the races as well. So that's my thoughts, what I think. I'll pass the same question back to you. How do you think it's going to go with these Pirelli tyres?
Pretty much the same again. Obviously, we want to stick mainly at Moto 3 because we will touch on it in Moto 2 as well in a bit. But I think Moto 3, it'll add just a bit of kind of race management is the only thing that's different. Obviously, they've been blowing every lap record they've ever meant to. Every track they've gone to, they've just blown it out of the water. So it clearly shows that they have a higher potential, but also the drop off is more. So you have much more strategic race, and we definitely had that today. And I think going forward, it's better because it's amazing for the viewer to see 16 laps of qualifying versus everyone just going for it. Whereas today we had all that drama that kind of goes through the whole race built up into the last 5 laps, and then kaboom, we had so many incidents that we'll cover in a bit. But it definitely changes the races because there was a lot less overtaking at the start. There was more management. It looked like people probably weren't going full throttle everywhere, especially there wasn't as many slipstream overtakes. So it's a big change. But we're going to jump now to another big change, and I'm going to throw back to you about the new KTM now. KTM this year brought a brand new bike for Moto 3. Lots of aero developments, pretty much brand new spec from the ground up. Come into Qatar, we had slight kind of whispers that it had a bit over the Honda. Now, personally, I didn't see it this weekend, but we'll kind of say this in probably all 3 classes. Qatar is the outlier. If you look at the last 6-7 years of every championship, whoever won in Qatar, or the few riders that did well in Qatar, it doesn't always mean they'll do well over the full season. So I'm kind of holding my judgment too much yet that maybe Honda are maybe further off, and at just Qatar it's a bit closer. But so far we've seen all of testing with the Pirellis and the new KTM and a full Grand Prix week. Rhys, do you think KTM have made a step? Do you think Honda are going to be missing, or is it going to be a bit more of a normal season?
Well, yes, like you say, everything we heard going into the season was that Honda actually also have sort of brought a new bike as well. I think it's worth noting they've brought a lot of new parts for their sort of existing bike. It's a bit of an evolution, so it isn't like they've just turned up the same bike again. They actually have made a decent step this time. I think it's because there was a development freeze for the last few years. I think they've sort of come out of that now, so both the manufacturers have brought a little bit more. If you look at the Honda on track, it looks the same. You can't see any difference, really. I think is the seat unit a little bit different, but again, that's not... I mean, I'm sure it makes a big difference in terms of riding it, but, it's not a massive change, whereas, like you said, the KTM, they've got all these aero fairings, they've got these little scoops. Now, the actual bike itself, if you take off the fairing, I imagine it looks very similar. It looks quite similar. The shape of it's very much the same, but it's got all this like aerodynamic stuff, which I don't really like. To be honest, I think Moto 3 and Moto 2, they don't need this aero stuff. And actually, I'd love to hear your opinion about this when I finish sort of making my point about it. But I thought the slipstream effect was actually less powerful this weekend than we've seen previously, and I wonder whether the KTM aero has something to do with that, whether they're trying to deliberately disturb the slipstream, and that's something that Ducati and KTM and the other manufacturers have tried to do in the MotoGP class. Apply those same factors to Moto 3, where the slipstream is even more important. Is that potentially something that's happening there? I'm not too sure, but like you said, I kind of agree with, I didn't see that massive disparity that we kind of expected. What we heard coming in, we heard the KTM was rapid. I mean, the KTM was breaking all the lap records. I mean, they were quicker than Crivier at like Jerez, like Crivier on a 500 GP bike, which was at the time. They've now destroyed that lap record, which is quite ridiculous, to be honest, on a Moto 3 bike. But yeah, I was expecting to see KTM's further up, but again, over the last 2 seasons of this podcast, we've spent many races saying the KTM looks like it has an edge, the KTM is better, and actually last year we had a Honda world champion, but I think that was more down to inconsistency of the KTM riders, Leopard team being really fantastic, which again is something we saw this weekend. So yeah, maybe they can make the gap up a little bit, but you see some of the lower down Honda teams like I was about to say Vision Track, but the MLAV Racing team, for example, they're a lot further back compared to some of the other Honda riders. I mean, maybe that's the team or the riders, maybe, but I think it does show that the Hondas probably, as a base, is further behind because you get more of the different KTM teams towards the front. But yeah, I was actually surprised to see that the KTM wasn't as overpowered compared to it, because Forosato and Adrian Fernandez especially were doing quite well. I think there was another Honda in the mix as well. I think Bertelli was somewhere up there. So yeah, but those also some of the guys that were there towards the end of last season, like Bertelli got a couple of front rows, Forosato was getting stuff sorted. Okay, Adrian Fernandez wasn't too bad the last couple of stand-ins he did, but he's basically on the Masia bike now, so call that. I think that's obviously a very, very good package. So obviously it won the championship last year, so yeah, to stop waffling, I was surprised to see the KTM wasn't as good as I thought it was going to be. But like you say, we'll have to see coming into the races, and also see if the Honda can make a step, because they're still trying to find a new base setting as well.
Yeah, for me with the Honda, it's the same bike with just a few new bits bolted on. I think for the big part, they're just trying to find the base setting. They're just trying to get dialed in. I heard Laverty obviously speaking of his own experience that they're just missing something setup wise, that they'll be closer when they again probably get it dialed in. I also am a bit surprised that KTM wasn't more dominant, because historically KTM have more top end overall, and at a track with such a long straight as Qatar, I thought it would really be more evident if it was such. But you make an interesting point, and I don't really have an answer for whether they've, like, if you first glance at the new KTM, you can straight away see the rear subframe unit is very much different. The front is slightly different, and then when you're on board with it, you can see a lot of differences. And the more you see it, there's a lot of these just kind of very minor curves and cutouts and little waves and stuff that obviously are really influencing the airflow. So they always want to streamline their own bike, but I suppose if they can streamline their own machine and make a bit of wake out the back, there's definitely a positive there. So I wouldn't be surprised, because there was many times today, Forosato, for example, it was in the slipstream, or David Alonso was in the slipstream of Holgado, and it was Yamaha Ducati moment where like he was sitting in a slipstream, but that's all he was doing. He couldn't go anywhere. So it was an interesting one. The commentators for TNT did speculate maybe a tailwind, which would explain it. If the wind is blowing them down the straight, there's less resistance for the rider in front, which means the slipstream isn't procrastinated back as heavy as normal. So maybe there's a bit of everything going on, but it's definitely a good little kind of a spot that maybe this year's KTM's fairing and kind of aero developments have maybe affected the slipstream for them. And I think when we get to maybe Texas, for example, when we do the real long back straight there, that we might have a better idea, because usually that's one of those ones where you get slipstream pass, and then it's so long you can nearly slipstream that person back and get them on the brake. So when we get there, it'll be a bit more maybe evident. But we're going to jump now into the actual Grand Prix, because we've yet to even get to lap 1, and we're still not going to get to lap 1 because David Munoz, first race of the season for them, and he made a big mess up at the start, then went against the basically race direction, waving his arms. It was a bit messy. Again, happened in GP, same thing happened, but they seemed to be a bit more on the ball, ready for it. But I'm going to throw back to you about this one. Did you think it was everyone was just a bit nervous first race of the season because they went onto the grid, told him to get off. He kind of said he had the bike started, gave him a little hand wave, told him to go away. Then 2 ran off and then 1 ran back on. It was just, for me, it looked a bit messy, and I think maybe a bit better management was needed for that situation, to be honest.
Yeah, you get this at round 1 sometimes. It does seem to happen more that they'll stall the bike or there'll be an electrical problem. Ultimately, the bike will cut out. So, yeah, I think maybe there's a little bit of nerves in that. It was very Marquez 2018 Argentina, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I'll bump start my bike and then ride backwards back to my grid spot. And I must say, I found it amusing the way he sort of like just grabbed the bike and wrenched it into his like into the right angle for his grid spot, because he got sort of alongside it and then just sort of wrenched it in there. And this rule is one of those ones that I have kind of mixed feelings on, because especially in this situation, obviously they have to stop the start very briefly because you can't have someone stored on the grid. But if they can get the bike started and back to the grid spot within 5-10 seconds, why not just start the start procedure at that point and just get the race underway? I don't really understand why they have to then go and start from the pit lane. If they've spent ages trying to get it started and everyone's had to stop and they have to switch the engines off because the bike's getting too hot, fair enough, put them at the pit lane because they've disrupted the start. But if they can get it started quickly and just rejoin this grid spot and they've not really caused any issue, I don't really see why they have to start from the pit lane. But if that's the rules, it's the rules. You've got to listen to the organisers. Munoz obviously tried not to do that, but then in the end got sort of fetched in anyway. So that actually ends up causing more disruption, because obviously then they were sitting on the grid for even longer waiting to start. Then he had to get forced into the pit lane. So again, that kind of comes back to my point. It's like, if they've managed to get the bike started and into their grid spot, maybe just leave them, because you've caused more disruption by pulling them off the grid. But, again, it is the rules, and I suppose it's hard to say, if they get it started, then that's okay, but if they don't get it started, it's not okay. So, yeah, it's kind of not unexpected for Munoz, as it's a sort of ignore the race direction and sort of having them shouting at him, and then he still sticks his hand up like, nah, it's all right. But in the end, he did listen, got his penalty, race over, right, at that point as well, which, again, is also another reason why I feel it's a bit harsh, because it's like, just completely ruined the guy's race, even though he actually had his bike started ready for the start. But yeah, it's a little bit silly. If the race direction are telling you to get off the track, you get off the track at the end of the day. You could be leaking fuel or anything, obviously in that instance you're not, but race direction, if they're telling you to get off the track, there's a reason for it. Whether it's a rule that you disagree with, whatever, it doesn't matter, you've got to do it. So yeah, a bit petulant there, and again, not something unexpected for Munoz.
The only argument I'd have about the rule is that if it was mechanical, and for example, you manage to somehow get it going in, and then as you go to take off again, as the lights go and everyone goes, you stall again, and then you're really in a dangerous situation. So maybe if there's any issue on the grid, you have to be taken off the grid is maybe the way I would look at it. And then that kind of, again, it's harsh for someone who's had a small little mishap and stalled it. But I think for the grand scheme of safety, that's probably why the rule there. Most rules are there for safety reasons. So that's the only reason I can think of that it's a bit harsh on the rider who stalls it, because you do see the odd time where a rider completely is just immobilized, and it would be very dangerous if, for example, 25-30 riders tried to come past him. It would be very, very dangerous trying to avoid him. And again, it's okay for the first couple behind him, but the ones that are getting into second, third gear, by the time you see him very unsighted, it could end in a horror crash. So that's probably the only reason really why they probably enforce the pit lane. And again, we see it later again in the GP1, and it was handled a bit better, I think. I think first race of the season, Moto3, it's always a bit tense regardless of what's going on track or not. So I think it was just a bit of early nerves, but we are now finally going to get to the actual race. And quite early in the race, we had a small incident in turn 1. Ivan Artola was going for a move around the outside pretty much into turn 1 of Rueda. Unfortunately, Rueda, from the angle we see, it looks like maybe a small front end bobble into a bit of a high side. It was one of those where it looks like the front offset the rear and kind of created a series of events, and eventually pings himself off and unfortunately takes Ivan Artola with him as well. And yeah, unfortunate for two really strong riders in this championship got early, because as obviously we see later, it's a group of 11. That would have been a group of 13. That's nearly a group from first to the end of the points. But what did you make of that one? Did you think it was complete rider error, or was there a bit of it was just a racing incident, or did you see were you leaning any way with it?
Yeah, it's just a racing incident, wasn't it? I think it was a rider sort of go up the inside of, well, they sort of leveled each other on the straight, weren't they? And sort of And Rueda
Yeah.
was sort of trying to go up the inside of Ortola, and Ortola sort of tries to hang it around the outside, which is always a risky play. And unfortunately, on this occasion, he had the consequence of that. Obviously, it was Rueda on the inside, like you said, had the little bobble, and then sort of the high side, which was a really brutal crash and a strange one to see at turn one. Really, you don't see a high side at turn one. Usually, it's usually a front end loss, and at least they didn't end up fighting in the gravel. We've seen that happen in Moto 3 at turn one before, so good that didn't happen. But yeah, just a bit of a racing incident. Unfortunate because, again, like you say, they were both. They were looking quick, they were looking good. They are probably going to be championship contenders this year, so for them to wipe each other out, really unfortunate. Obviously, field ball probably for Ortola because he was the innocent party, but again, was trying to risk it around the outside. And I suppose karma kind of worked out that he was able to remount, and fortunately, Rueda was okay, but he wasn't able to actually get back into the race. And then he put on what was a very, very good ride. Did Ortola back through the pack? I think did he finish ninth in the end, which is pretty incredible because
He did indeed.
A crash to ninth is unbelievable because it wasn't like he lost a small amount of time. He picked it up pretty quick, but it was a hefty little crash, and obviously he actually ended up behind David Munoz, who we previously mentioned said his race was ruined by his pit lane sort of penalty, but he actually managed to get back up to about like 15th or something like that, whereas Ortola managed to get all the way back up into the top 10, which was obviously helped by a few incidents later on, but still, you've got to stay in the race, and he'd had an incident himself, so it's not like you could say, oh, we got lucky, because, I mean, he definitely didn't get lucky in that race, so, yeah, good ride from him. Unfortunate to see that incident, but these things happen, just a racing incident. It came up saying it was investigated at the bottom. I don't know whether maybe that's a new stance that they're taking this year, where if there's a crash, they're just going to investigate it regardless, even if it's clearly a racing incident, just to, thoroughly have a good look at it. Obviously, no further action taken, obviously the right decision. And yeah, it's a shame to have that happen so early in the season, but you know what, these things happen, especially in Moto 3.
I'm going to throw you under the bus here and ask you a question completely off of left field. How many seconds off the win was Ortola, do you believe? P9?
Was he like about 11 seconds off? 10 seconds, something like that, right?
You are, we'll go with your second answer, 10.019 seconds off, which is a bit outrageous considering he was taking out a turn one and he was taking out mid corner, which
but he was sliding down for more than 10 seconds.
that's it. Like, so it shows that I think at one point he was catching Josh Watt and he was over 3 seconds quicker a lap. So
I remember hearing that's ridiculous.
That just shows that
there's obviously the tyre delta, but there's not really. There should never be that much of a difference.
Yeah, exactly. I know it was crazy seeing coming back, but again, start of the race we had the Munoz issue, then we had a couple of riders go down, but then we end up having a very big group of 11. Your standard Moto 3 race in a sense, but a bit more calm. Was there anything other than the calmness of the race that surprised you that the group 11 was probably being a bit respectful? And obviously we saw a couple of Hondas up there that maybe we weren't expecting, but was there anything that caught your eye in the group of 11 at the start, kind of midpoint of the race?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose you've pretty much covered my two surprises there. Obviously it was quite relaxed, especially if you compare it to last time we were at Qatar. That was a little bit more interesting, a bit more dirty, especially with one of the riders that was in that group, Adrian Fernandez. He was making a nuisance of himself that time. But yeah, I was surprised to see that it was kind of a bit more steady. But I think they were just looking after the tyres a little bit. And I think Holgado, who was out front, was kind of backing them up a bit. I think there was definitely more pace in there, but obviously he was just trying to look after his tyre. And I think he was just doing the usual kind of just use the tyre a little bit in a couple of places to make sure it doesn't get past. But then obviously just hold them up everywhere else to look after the tyre. And that's kind of where my whole slipstream theory came from, because the amount of times that, not even the Honda, like the Honda you can explain that way by just saying, well, the Honda's just not as quick as the KTM. Well, there's other KTM right in the slipstream, perfect, just same speed the whole way down the straight, couldn't catch him. That's when I think about this whole slipstream thing. But so again, I guess that was a surprise for me. And actually kind of to see the Hondas up there so much obviously was a surprise, especially Adrian Fernandez, because yes, it's a Leopard Honda, but I didn't really think of him as a guy that could make up the difference if the bike's not quite there, or, when he was in Moto 3 before, it was never spectacular. He was quite good at the end of last season, actually, when he did his few sort of not standing replies, they kind of sacked Suzuki, didn't they, early to put him in, but it was kind of, he did a little bit better. But if you compare him to how he was previously, he was in Max Racing, and what was he, in the Tech 3 team as well, the Tech 3 Red Bull team at one point, and never really did a lot, did he? But yeah, I was quite surprised to see him there. And Furusato, again, sort of continuing his form from the end of last season. It'd be interesting to see what he could have done on a KTM if he'd been a little bit stronger, even with the podium finish. But of course, you'll never see that with him being definitely a HRC rider. But yeah, that's pretty much my standout. Really, was obviously a bit more mundane than your typical Moto3 race, but still sort of a big group. But I think maybe a big group more because of the tyre management rather than the usual slipstream reason that you get a big group in Moto3.
Yeah, and like you said, they're a bit more mundane, but then we get to about 5 laps to go, and someone pulls the pin really, and you have your standard Moto3 race condensed. It was essentially a Moto3 sprint race, is what we end up getting, because we had 11 riders. Ended up being, I think, like 7 of them crossed the line out of that, a group of 11.
Yeah, there was a few missing, wasn't there?
There was a few went on holidays a bit early, so we're going to just basically dive into the last 5 laps. It was just like someone flicked a switch. It really was a completely race of two halves. We had the kind of nice steady race, a few slight overtakes, a few just kind of just slightly edging people off the race line. Then we just had the axe murderers of Motor 3 go head to head for 5 laps at Qatar. And to be fair, lots of incidents, lots of overtaking, and then we had a brilliant last lap. So we're going to pretty much just throw it over to you for the last kind of 5 laps for pretty much what was the main incidents that we saw over the last couple of laps.
So obviously, kind of the first one that we saw was actually David Alonso sort of getting pushed back a little bit. He was, he's known for being very aggressive. He's known for his racecraft, which obviously we'll come on to in a little bit, I imagine. But he was running second behind Holgado for most of the race, but then he kind of just got shuffled back a bit. I think basically somebody made a pass at him, he lost a bit of momentum, somebody else dives at the inside, and someone dives at the inside, and he just got shuffled back to a bit further back in the pack, which was a bit of a surprise. That was kind of the first thing that happened. And then he was sort of making his way through, and then we had like Adrian Fernandez trying to hang around the outside, and he crashed, and then he cut another ride as well with that, didn't he? So it was a bit chaotic.
Vicente Perez, I think, in front of
was it Perez? Yeah, Perez actually did very well this weekend for being a stand-in ride for. I actually forget the rider's name now, but the Aya rider that's not actually old enough yet to join the category. So it was a good ride from Perez. He was looking quite good up until that point. So it was unfortunate for him to get taken out, because I'd feel pretty confident saying that would have been probably one of his best results. He never really showed much amazing speed when he was in Moto3 full time, so he probably one of his better rides. But yeah, those were the sort of the two standout moments that happened in those last couple of laps. And then obviously it was all about Alonso trying to make his way back through because he'd been shoved back, and can Holgado hang on to win? Because we've seen Holgado can be aggressive. Mandalika last year, he rode very strangely in some situations, but we've also seen him get beat up quite easily. So it was kind of that, can he manage to lead it from the front and keep the other riders behind? And that's when the dive bombs really started coming out as well from some of the riders further back again. You struggle to remember all the overtakes because there's so many, especially compared to the first part of the race. But into turn 6, I'm sure they were about 4 abreast at one point, which it's always interesting. It's a corner that tight.
There's just 2 incidents I want to go slightly further back in the race and just want to get your opinion on. Ryusa Yamanaka, off the edge of a curb, nasty crash coming through turn 3 on the way to turn 4, as well as Bertelli, similar crash as well, just jumps off the back of the curb, gets a bit upset, and actually another rider was involved in that one. I can't actually remember who that was at the time.
It's Farioli, wasn't it?
Was it Farioli? Yeah, I knew it was one of the...
further back in the pack, wasn't it, outside of the lead?
Yeah, exactly. Now, obviously we saw Jerez this year has made these massive, they're called Mazzano curbs that they've been kind of formally named, but we again see them here in Qatar. The whole purpose for the curb really is that as they get further out to get more striations, get more aggressive, they'd hire you basically drop off the edge of the curb, and instead of 1 tick next to your name for track limits, you lose maybe half a second, 7/10 if you get it really badly wrong, and there's your penalty there and then you're done. Fall back in, and there you go. Now we saw we saw 2 crashes because of it. On the penultimate lap, someone else did it. Don't remember who, but it was the same position. Now we're out of into turn 15. I think they were just coming out of the fast right, and someone just dipped over and had a bit of a tank slapper. Now thankfully saved it because that was a big group at the point. So do you think it's a good decision to try and go away from the track limits penalties and enforce it by having tracks that penalise you for going over the limits, or is it a step too far? Because I'm a bit borderline the fact that we saw 2 nasty crashes today with it.
We also had in the Asia Talent Cup as well, Ogiwara in race 1 did the same thing into the first of the fast rights. He was leading the race. He actually had a rider right behind him, and he just stepped slightly over that curb, had a massive, pretty big high side, and crashed unfortunately. So again, another instance of it happening, obviously over the course of the weekend, which it kind of raises the question. But then also,
I didn't see any issues with it in Moto 2. I didn't see any issues with it in MotoGP. So I'd say that's more of a Moto 3 either issue to do with the class itself because they have to carry that speed onto the curbs, or just sort of the mistakes of the riders. And first of all, I really like the fact that there's no track limits issues. You don't have to look, who's got a track limits warning, or, he might touch the green on the last lap. I like it, you run a bit wide. I mean, remember Phillip Island? That's pretty much the only track up to this point that's had that kind of not be a problem. Because you go off the track at Phillip Island, you go on the grass. And what happens? No one goes off the track. It is one of those things, but and it's nice not to have the issues with the track limits, because nobody likes track limits. I mean, no one likes penalties at all, really, do they? Obviously, they have to be doled out when you've broken the rules or whatever, but no one really likes watching a track limits penalty. You don't like watching an epic last lap battle and then not knowing who's actually won the race until 5 minutes later, or not being sure if someone's touched the green. You're like, he was close to the edge of the track there, whereas, here, if you've run off the track at the penultimate turn at Qatar, you've lost the place. Like, it's pretty clear you've made the mistake. Happened to Bagnaia in qualifying, didn't it? Or was it practice? I think it happened to him.
No,
it might
Q2.
be qualifying, actually.
Yeah, Q2, because he was on to go top and then run to the corner and ran wide.
Yeah, he ran it wide, and under normal circumstances, he'd been starting P12 because, maybe not P12. He probably had another lap, but you know what I mean. He'd have had that lap completely taken away from him. But in this situation, he lost the time, didn't get pole position, but he kept the lap time because he just lost time with the mistake, which I think is the best way for it to be. But then you look on the flip side, we have these issues with people stepping over the edge of the curb. Now, again, that's the issue of the rider doing that. Obviously, that's always going to be a problem. Doesn't matter what curbs you've got. If you dip off the edge of a curb, there's always the chance that you could crash. If it's wet, for example, you dip off as a bit of water lying to the side of the curb. You high side. We've seen it happen at Misano. Actually, I suppose Misano. I don't know how long they've had the curbs there at Misano, but I've definitely seen people have these kind of crashes at Misano before. So I don't know whether it is to do with the specific Misano curbs or whether it's just a bit coincidental that we've seen crashes there. So that element of it I don't like, because obviously you don't want, Yamanaka especially, like his bikes, him and his bikes slid across the entire track basically, right? So if he was in a pack, fortunately he was at the back of the pack, so no one was behind him. But there was people behind him, they might have hit him or hit his bike, or it could have been horrible really, which is the problem with these things. But again, it is down to the riders to not do that, but they are going to make mistakes, so it's tough. It's tough. I think maybe it's not a perfect solution, but it's definitely it's a solution to the issue. And there obviously are cons with it. Maybe the whole green thing is better because it's safer, but then at the same time, people will go miles off the track and then cutting back on and things like that, which is not safe either. So I don't know. I don't know if there's a exact science to it. Maybe they could reduce the drop a little. So that the time is still lost, but then if you do drop over, you're not as likely to crash. Maybe that's an option. I don't know exactly how what the balance is, because obviously if you make the drop too small, you don't lose the time, so you need to go back to the track limits. But then if the drop's too big, you have big issues like this. So yeah, I kind of, I know I'm proper fence sitting here, but I don't really know how I feel about it, because I really like it as a concept, but if it's dangerous, you can't have it. So it is just sort of weighing up those two arguments.
Yeah, as you were going on there, I was kind of thinking back and forth about it, and again, track limits has been an issue for many years, and I don't think there's one easy answer, because everyone says, just put grass and they'll stop using it, but it's one of those things where in a race battle, someone could just get edged out and then you have a terrible crash again when someone just dips a wheel onto the grass. Now, I do think it's a bit more of an issue in Moto 3 because they're so stiff and light at the same time that when they have that little moment, it's very hard for them to kind of come back in, whereas you see a lot of times the pumping from the GP bikes and the Moto 2 bikes where they kind of power through, and as if something upset them, they can kind of keep going. Whereas when Moto 3 get out of shape, it very, very rarely kind of comes back in line. So it's something we'll have to manage through the season and kind of have maybe come back to it after a couple more races to see if it's actually any better. But it definitely was nice to be not have to worry about, or it's 4 laps to go now, top 3, 2 of them have a little warning next to their name, so they'll have to be careful, and that's going to stop maybe an overtake because then they'll get penalised. So it let the race play out more naturally, which is definitely a positive. But then again, the couple like Yamanaka's crash, because he ends up going and hitting the wall on the inside. Now he kind of slides alongside him, gives it a small tap, but a very slight change to that crash and he could be going a lot harder into that wall, and then you're having a much bigger incident. So
If you're going head first or something,
Yeah,
his
exactly.
back hit it, but yeah.
Exactly. So it's not a perfect change at the moment, but I do agree it's probably better, but it's just the fact that if we can kind of minimize these weird crashes off them, and again, maybe everyone's still in the mode where it's like, right, we need to push the limits to the absolute limit, and if I get a penalty, I get a penalty, whereas people are probably going to realize that I can't really afford to crash by going off the edge of a curb, so maybe people or riders themselves will just reel it in small. But we're going to finish off the Moto 3 segment with David Alonso, his last lap race. It was a bit special, you could say, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, it's kind of what we've come to expect with him, isn't it, at this point?
100%.
Because he did it a few times last year. He started off the season doing it well. Again, he's been top in most of the tests. We knew he was going to basically be one of the favourites going into this round. But like I was on about earlier, sort of when I was talking about it, that he dropped down to 6th. You don't usually come back from that, but he just sived his way through. He's just overtaking everybody. Wasn't ridiculously overly aggressive either. Wasn't dangerous. We've seen with Onchu and Munoz and riders like that in the past where they've pulled some ridiculous passes. And it's been ridiculously dangerous. Darren Bender, another one as well. We've seen some, just over the line Alcoba. I could keep listing off as Moto 3. There's plenty of riders that have done it, but it's like clinically clean. It's a bit more, I don't know. It's just that aggression, but like nice. Maybe a bit more like Martin in MotoGP is a bit, it's a bit aggressive, but it's pretty clean most of the time. And I liked seeing that, and the way he just then sort of set up the last few corners as well. Obviously, he made sure he got the drive and down to the last corner. And I think it's worth noting as well, because we haven't mentioned it in the podcast so far, but the finish line was actually in a different position this year to previous years. It was actually much closer to the last corner than it has been previously, which kind of, in the past, Qatar, you're better just sitting and waiting for the slipstream and trying to drag them to the line. Whereas now, you can't do that. I mean, even without these slipstream conspiracies that I've come up with, even without that, you're not going to do it. So you have to make the pass into the last corner. That's exactly what he did. And it was a little bit Sasaki-esque from Holgado. Not enough defences that last corner, potentially. And again, it is tricky because you need to get a good run. You don't want to get dragged to the line. But because the run is shorter now, it's not as important. And you just have to sit enough to the inside that it's kind of hard for the rider, or they're going to have to really go tight. You can then sort of move towards the outside for the actual turn again anyway. So a little bit like what we saw Lopez do in Moto 2, which I'm sure we'll come on to later. So yeah, I think really it was a mixture of Alonso being magic and maybe not defensive enough from Holgado, which is tricky. It's a tricky position to play, must be said. And like I said, we have seen him maybe not be so good at this in the past. He's sort of been beaten up, but Alonso is just so clinical. He just sort of slides up the inside so cleanly, like he can take those tighter lines and still get it stopped. So yeah, just kind of a bit of a combination really between Alonso being just that good and Holgado maybe just not quite defending enough.
The big thing for me in the last lap was out of the slow kind of little ascent section up into the fast rights. Many laps there, he came out of there and he could have just leveled the ride but couldn't get past. But that's where he made the overtake on Ferrasada, and it just had so much more speed and grip. It looked like it was like it just, when he wanted to go, he went. So it was crazy that he just kind of manifested this extra speed out of nowhere on this last lap to make the so many overtakes. And again, he just cut through them so easily and made it look very good. And again, I do kind of see the incident with kind of Holgado there. He just doesn't defend it enough. He just is maybe a bit naive in thinking that, well, I've just done enough, he won't be able to go for it. But Alonso sends it nicely and just in a nice, clean manner and just gets it done perfectly and gets him to the line. So just still maybe something to learn for Holgado. But Alonso, again, you have to tip your hat to him. He was probably expecting a better race coming into race than he actually had, but still at the end when it matters he managed to get himself over the line first, and again it was a perfect way to start off his championship start. So Rhys, for Moto 2 I have a question. Now obviously you can see the notes there, I already know the question's coming, but I'm going to guess you'll disagree, but I think I'll disagree with your disagreement. Biggest rule change ever for Moto 2, going from Dunlop to Pirelli. Do you agree or disagree?
It's definitely one of the biggest changes that's ever happened in Moto 2. I don't know whether maybe it's quite as big as the Triumph change, because of course that changes everything about the characteristic of the bike. But again, obviously the tyres are the part that sticks to the track, so
it is pretty important. And we've seen over the years, even just Dunlop tyre changes themselves, I mean, have changed things. They effectively ended Tom Luty's career, right, by bringing a new front tyre. It was like 2019 or whatever. He just dropped off and said the same. I know it affected Jorge Navarro for quite a while, I think, when they did something similar. And I think the Bosco Oscuro actually, especially, got affected quite a bit by it. But yeah, I don't know. I'm going to tend to say maybe no, not the biggest change because of I think maybe the Triumph one is still slightly bigger, but yeah, it's certainly a game changer for Moto2 because just the way the race has to be played now is so different because the tyres they don't last for like the whole season now. You actually have to look after the tyres, which is something we've seen at Qatar before, even with the Dunlops. So yeah, maybe we don't have to get too carried away with it, with what we saw in this race, because we've seen some strange results. I mean, who can forget Nagashima winning, right, like at Qatar? Where was he the rest of the season after that? I mean, I know that was even a weirder season because it was the COVID season, but there was some weird time where I think Marini went from like fighting for the win to being like knocked off at P14 like the last corner. So yeah, it just kind of shows how strange this track can be. But yeah, I think maybe not quite as big as the Triumph change, but very close for me.
The only thing that I kind of would put it above the Triumph is the Triumph one came in and it didn't really change the racing. The racing was still very spread out. It maybe made some different racing lines and maybe some different options, and you could try different things and ride. Maybe it probably made the class more broad because the old 600 Hondas were just you had to kind of ride them a certain way, and it was probably harder to get up to speed because there was only one way to really ride it. Whereas the Triumph came in and you have a bit more power to certain riders, and it just gave them a different way of riding. But I feel with the Pirellis, it just changes the racing completely to the point where we've always seen the Dunlops. Okay, fair enough, we've seen the odd race here where in Qatar it's a bit of a tyre race, but I think we're going to get more of these races throughout the season where the Dunlop tyres just don't last, and we'll have bigger groups and we'll have battles to the last lap. Like Moto2 today was one of the best ones I've seen in a long time. There was like so many different stories going on because we have the start, and people who went backwards came forward. There's people who looked like they should really be up there went backwards, and then people that should have no business being up in the podium spots there. And of course we'll cover it on a bit, but it was just so many different riders, so many different stories, and it just maybe I'm getting a bit excited because it was one good Moto2 race for a while. But for me, I'm just putting it slightly above the Triumph one just because right now, after one race, it's changed the racing enough for me to think that it might be a very positive step to the class. Now, unfortunately, we were one man down before we even got to 4 red lights before the start of race 1. Jake Dixon of Great Britain race, unfortunately, is out. Do you want to explain what happened to your fellow Briton?
Yeah, so sort of going into, well, sort of during the first of the 2 rights, going into the second, was it free practice 3, I think it was? Or the third practice session. Well, I don't know what it's actually called because they've changed again this year, isn't it? I think what is it?
Practice 3, I think, isn't it?
I think it's called practice 2 because I think the first session is now FP1 and then you have P1 and then P2. Just to make it more confusing. But
yeah.
Anyway, it was Saturday morning, so yeah, that kind of makes things a bit easier. Or I guess it's not quite morning with Qatar, but anyway, that session, you know what I mean. It was going into sort of the fast right-handers, and the rear just sort of lets go. Big crash, flung quite high up into the air, slams down, and unfortunately that was the end of his weekend right there because he was in a lot of pain by the sounds of it. He had to then go for some CT scans, and what they were saying on TNT Sports today was that apparently he had a bit of fluid on the lung, I think is what they said, and an air pocket. So he couldn't even travel home because, of course, the pressure in the cabin and the plane and stuff, you can't have that when you've got, obviously, air inside you because it could cause some damage. So, unfortunately for Jake, out of this race. Will he race in Portimao? I don't know. Depends how long it takes to recover, how bad the injury actually is. I suppose, again, when you've got fluid, it's hard to tell because it kind of masks a lot of the injury because it blocks the scan, basically. So you don't know how bad it could be. He could recover very quickly, or maybe he might have to miss that one and come back for the USA. Don't really know. But unfortunately, he was probably one of the riders that was down as, definitely a rider that could be quite quick this season. Maybe not a title favourite, but somebody that definitely could be up there. Because again, he was one of the fastest. He was almost third in the championship last year until Adaguer's really good run of form in the end. So again, pretty much one of the top 3 riders out of the ones that are still left in the class, let's say, because Acosta's already gone. So that was a top runner out already on Saturday morning, and a nasty crash. And we do wish Jake a speedy recovery on that one.
Yeah, it's unfortunate because obviously win last year was building. It was just very consistent last year. And you thought maybe coming into this, he's a bit more experienced, a bit older than we'll say some of the other favourites, your Canet, your Aldeguer.
He's the oldest guy in the class this year.
So he's probably it's probably a perfect year for him, and it's a big fat 0 so far. I'd be surprised if he turns up to Portimao, to be honest, because that was a big crash. The fluid in the lungs as well is something he'll need to rest and stuff. So it's going to be, if he misses the first 2 races, you're kind of already thinking that's probably his season done, because as much as he's experienced and has speed, you don't expect him to go win 9-10 races this season and maybe do what Acosta did last year. You kind of expect him to maybe win it on kind of podiums if he was going to get for a title charge. So unfortunately, not the ideal start for the Briton at the start of this season, but we wish him well, and hopefully we'll see him back in Portimao. Now, to kind of back up the Pirelli start of the season, Moto2 looked so open. Throughout the practice, I didn't really have any idea what was going on. A lot of testing was up in the air. Riders that were maybe struggling last year, different chassis, different tyres, a bit of everything going on. To be honest, I don't really know who's the favourite of Moto2, because everything we're going off in terms of the form book was on last year on the Dunlop tyres, which is such a big change. So we've seen a lot of changes just throughout the order, and again, there's probably some riders who've benefited, some people have gone a step back. For example, Vietti. I suppose while we're on the topic of KTM rider, I suppose the KTM badged Calyx, the Pyro Mobility Group, basically every one of them is on WP suspension this year, which looks like they're slightly behind the 8-ball as well. Rhys, do you think that's just needing a bit of dialing in, or do you think that they're maybe going to be like KTM when they were in the Moto2 class, where maybe a 4 or 5 races a season where they're really good but kind of just a bit off at everywhere else, or is it just a matter of they need more track time?
I think it's difficult because, yeah, like you said, there's so much change. I guess that's why they've decided to take the plunge with it now. Obviously, talk about the favourites going into this one as well. I think Aldeguer is probably one of the favourites, but obviously it didn't really work out for him this weekend. Vietti probably was one that was tipped because he's on that IO team, but obviously, like you say, the WP suspension for the Pyro Mobility Group is obviously also something in the CF Moto team, the team that Jake Dixon's in, and Isa Guevara, the Moto3 champion, and of course Darren Binder, and it is Senna Agius, isn't it, in the Intact GP team. So all 3 of those teams on the WP. WP also trying to keep the spirit of Moto2 and make a more cost-effective suspension, not to make it a cost race. So they're not actually doing carbon forks at all. They're trying to do, I guess, steel. I guess that would be the I don't know exactly what material you'd use instead, but basically they're not basing it on their MotoGP fork, which I guess was something they could have done, I suppose. They did make Moto2 suspension years ago. Zarco won both his championships on WP suspension, if I'm not mistaken. So it's not like they're completely new to the category. But of course, the bikes have changed since then. We had that massive Triumph change. We've now had this Dunlop change as well. So things are very different. I can't imagine that data is going to be that useful. But yeah, it'll probably take them a few rounds to get sorted. With them having 3 teams worth of data, that's going to definitely help. Obviously, there'll be some tests as well. Just the more data on the tyres as well, and I'm sure they can compare to last year's data, because effectively the chassis is going to be pretty much the same. I'd imagine the engines are the same. So yes, there's 2 big factors there, but you can kind of maybe start to look at what the difference was and see with the data. So I think maybe after a few rounds I'll get dialed in, and they certainly looked better on race day. Guevara definitely did until his race went a bit backwards, but he certainly looked a bit more. He looked to be the top of the WP guys effectively this weekend. He looked a bit more comfortable. So not a million miles away. And as we've seen, some weekends the Bosco Scuro works really well. Sometimes it's the Calyx that's better. Even, back a few seasons ago, the forward bike worked pretty well at Valencia, for example. So yeah, there could very well be tracks where the WP suspension is significantly better than what's else. But I guess I'll just have to see how it develops, because it's not something we've particularly seen for a while, because usually you just get Calyx, or you're on Bosco Scuro, or you're on forward, but now you actually have a divided Calyx camp where some Calyx is different to others. So I guess we'll have to see how the season develops. I imagine they will make a step, but you never know. They did struggle towards the end of their tenure as a KTM chassis when they had the KTM chassis. Obviously they started off pretty well. First season was quite good. Second season was quite good as well, but a bit mixed. After that, though, it really dropped off, didn't it? And I think it was for 2020 they scrapped the project completely. So, yeah, they've got proven pedigree in Moto 2, but we'll have to see. We'll have to see because things are very different these days.
The class has kind of gone back in time before the Triumph engine era, really, because we have probably more diversity throughout the class in terms of different chassis and now different suspension as well. So it's a bit of everything because kind of if you go from, we'll say 19,
there's still like 20 something Calexes. It's not that diverse.
Yeah, but the fact that there's a couple of Calexes on WP, there's a few other. It's going in the right direction because it was becoming very much Calex Cup, and it was only okay. And again, I think that was because a lot of the racing was getting worse because of the Calex. So again, the fact that today,
would you rather have Rabat 20 seconds ahead of Calio 20 seconds? Bring that old comparison back again.
That's true too. So yeah, now obviously, Moto 2 was always the kind of conundrum of how do you get good racing in a spec kind of cost effective class. And again, I think the fact we've gotten rid of Dunlops, because I think Dunlops, a lot of riders complained that Dunlops they were too cost effective, maybe was probably the right way, the polite way of saying it. So maybe we have a bit of rubber that will burn up and change a bit now throughout the season. Again, the fact that it looks like the speed up Bosco Shore chassis, whatever you want to call them, are probably the best they've been. Obviously, again, they do seem to go well in Qatar and Lusail, as they've always pretty much done. So are we probably going to get this throughout the season? No, but we did see the Calex is struggling a bit more today than I expected, to be honest. So the fact of the matter is, maybe as well that the likes of Igor, Sergio Garcia are on the Bosco Store chassis. You have a bit of a higher pedigree on the other machinery, so we'll see throughout the season. But it's going to be definitely a bit more. I think 1-2 again, as we kind of made the point, it's very open. So I'm optimistic for a really kind of different season because, again, it's always been good to watch. It's good to see the talent building and kind of making its way, but it's always one like you have the Moto 3 race, you kind of chill out and go on your phone from Moto 2, and then you have the Premier class. But we're going to move now to someone who is a breath of fresh air today, Barry Baltus. A fun fact, he's named Barry after Barry Sheene. His number 7 is after Barry Sheene, and he gets his first podium today, 21 years on from the passing of Barry Sheene. So if you're a fan of the numbers, today is a big day for the numbers. But Rhys, what did you make of Baltus? Obviously came in as a 16-year-old 3 years ago at this rate now. Has been slowly building, showed some real flashes last year, but he was very, very hot, you could say, today.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I kind of remember seeing him in Moto 3. He didn't do a lot, I guess, because of his size mainly. And I don't know if the team he was in was particularly fantastic. So he never really did a lot. And I remember seeing he got moved up to Moto 2, and I was like, what? I was like, why is this guy moved to Moto 2? Obviously, then started to make sense because he was just too big for Moto 3. That's why. Because I also thought, I know this kid's really young, so like, why have they moved him up so quickly when he's not really proving anything? But he's been chipping away. At the first year on the NTS, that's going to be a tough year, doesn't matter who you are. It wasn't really a fancy chassis, was it? Then obviously they swapped over to the Calex, and he got another young teammate alongside him, Zonta. They had a fairly quiet season, but maybe started to do the odd little bits. And then there was last season, Baltus started qualifying. He's getting through to Q2 a bit more consistently. He's having the odd good result. You'd see him in races sometimes. Did he get a top 5 last year? I think he did, right?
Top 6 was his best result until today.
Top 6. Yeah, I know he's fighting for the top 5 in one race, so he probably just dropped back. But yeah, we started to see him a bit more where he was perhaps top in the odd session or being towards the top of some of the practices, qualifying a bit better, being, somewhat in the main leader's shot in some of these races. And then coming into this season, again, take another step. And it seems like that team as a whole have taken a step, because you could say similar things for his teammate Zonta last year. Had the odd race, that's pretty good. Was looking really good in practice. Didn't quite have the race today, although, to be fair, if you look at the result, I think it's still quite good for him. But Baltus, nobody expected Baltus to be fighting for the podium today. I don't even think Baltus expected Baltus to be fighting for the podium today. You know what I mean? It was one of the things that just came out of nowhere. And he was Calex. He was the lead Calex. Like, he was carrying the flag of Calex, because that was actually, like you were saying, the Bosco Scuro looking the best it's ever had. So it was 3 of the top 4. like running at that point. It was ridiculous. He really, really did a good job, and it was such a shame for him to not win. I was really willing him on to win the race because that would have been something a bit special. And obviously they dropped the Barry Sheene stat as he went over the line, but yeah, it was a fantastic ride. He looked comfortable up there. He was riding so differently to everybody else. He looked really aggressive. He was spinning the tyre, but he didn't seem to wear the tyre. And I kind of theorised that over the course of the weekend, they've been saying that actually, surprisingly enough, one of the issues with the Pirelli tyres is actually keeping temperature in the tyre. Like, it's difficult to do. And I wonder whether maybe his larger size generates a bit more temperature in the tyre. It's usually a pretty big disadvantage, but in the rain conditions, it's a bit of an advantage sometimes. And perhaps in cool conditions or conditions where he's struggling to get the temperature into the tyre, worked for him. The way he was spinning the tyre maybe was keeping the temperature in, because it actually looked like the front tyre was where people were struggling, so maybe the rear tyre had a bit more to give, and he was making the most of that, and he was just looking so good. He looked like he could just size it up a couple of times on Alonso, but fair play to Lopez. He did do a good defence, but yeah, really happy for Barry. Hopefully it's the start of something kicking on. I wouldn't expect to maybe see him up here every weekend, because again, we've said this, Qatar's a bit of an outlier. We've had some random winners here in the past, random good results, but even still, good to see the lad up there. He really deserves it. He's chipping away. He's been in Moto2 for a few years now, and it's been tough for him because he's moving up at such a young age. But it was a great ride. Great ride. Looked like he'd been in the class a long time. I know I said he's done a few rounds, a few seasons, but still relatively inexperienced for Grand Prix. You know, because usually they've gone through Moto3. Like most riders would have done as many seasons in Moto3 as he's done in Moto2, and then moved up to Moto2 and done a couple of seasons and decided to look like this. So, yeah, really, really good result from him, and I hope it's the start of, you know, seeing him a bit more regularly.
Yeah, again, you do mention that Qatar is the outlier, and I think Moto2 Qatar is the biggest outlier. You mentioned Nagashima, go back to Baldassari, you can go back to Vietti. Qatar Moto2 opening race of the season is the biggest RNG race you'll get of the season. I think that's pretty much agreed across the board. So, again, you're kind of all the positives we've seen today. So the as you could say, Zonta's teammate speed, Sergio Garcia's first podium, Barry Bottas as well. So we're just hoping that these aren't Qatar specific results, and that he's built up to this point of the season. So hopefully when we get to Portimao, kind of Texas, maybe we can see some more strong results, because it'll be really good to see again a different nationality. When's the last time a Belgian was up there? I think was the last one. It would have been Simeon was the last race winner.
Baltas was good at USA last year as well, I'm pretty sure, from what I remember, so keep an eye out for him at Kota.
Yeah, so there we go. Kota, Baltas win confirmed now. One man was able to have Baltas' number today, and that was the Spaniard on another buster score, no surprise. Alonso Lopez, tough 23 season to be fair to him. Was well beaten by his teammate. Kind of lost his way a small bit, got into a lot of unnecessary scraps and incidents with riders in and out of the paddock on track. Looked calm today. Obviously had a couple of questionable overtakes and on the limit overtakes, you could say, into, we'll say, turn 6 a few times, but to be fair, clean overall. And to be honest, right, he judged that race perfectly, because just had enough everywhere just to make Baltas not really have anything he could do. Baltas couldn't do it on the brakes into the one. Maybe the extra bit of weight that Baltas had just kind of took it off him out of the last corner and wouldn't give him enough into turn 1. Baltas was really strong into penultimate corner, T15 I believe, so there were a couple of opportunities you could have had. He could have maybe tried to stuff into turn 6, but just Alonso really just defended so well in all the key points of track. And to be fair, Qatar has a bit of reputation as a hard track to race because of, we'll say, the skinny, dirty racing lane. That's very hard, but you still get good races in the lower classes. So the fact that he wasn't able to make any overtake on Lopez really just shows how well Lopez's race was. I think that was a bit of an underrated performance on Lopez. What do you think?
Yeah, it was a masterclass on how to defend, right? I mean, it's so difficult to defend from someone behind, but if you defend well in the way that he did, it's impossible to overtake. You cannot do it. If you defend correctly, you cannot overtake without making it dirty, because you've got to, like, the way he's positioning the bike, he was positioning it sort of in the middle of the track and then drifting a little bit more as they got towards the corner, or he was just pulling it down. So he was kind of blocking the inside, stopping himself from being out-braked, because if you went any tighter than he did, you're not making the corner, or you just can't brake that late, so he's going to out-brake you. But then he was getting it stopped on the apex, so it wasn't giving the chance for the undercut, and was also picking up the power very well so that he was getting out the corner and not getting dragged. So it really was a fantastic ride. To be honest, I don't think his passes were borderline at all, really. I thought it was actually quite good today. Aggressive, as always, but I don't think there was anything really wrong with anything he did. A couple of times he proper beeline for the inside, but that is his style, I guess. That's how he goes about it. He didn't knock anybody off this time, so it's an improvement over last season. It was like you say, he had a tough year last year. I mean, it wasn't too bad. He kind of got a bit comprehensively beat by his teammate, but he had some good rounds himself, and I don't know, it seems like in the speed-up team, there's one rider doing well and one doing bad. There's never really, they're never both at the front together, which is crazy, especially when you think Aldeguer destroyed everybody in this race last year. He comes to the same track, yes, okay, there's a big tyre change, but it was looking good pretty much. The first few practice sessions he was looking good. He didn't qualify too badly, obviously got a silly penalty, but then was kind of nowhere in the race, and I think maybe there was a wrong tyre choice for some of the more competitive riders, Tony Arbolino being another one as well, so be interested to see what they actually have to say after the race and how they perform from this point onwards. But yeah, Lopez, clearly the Bosco Scuro was working. There was 3 of them in the top 4. Has that ever happened before? I doubt it, honestly. Maybe 2010 or something like that, but I can't see it ever happening before, because there's only been a couple of seasons where there's been more than 2 of them, so... And that was back in the Aspar days. So maybe there was a round where like Digi, Navarro, and Canet were in the top 4 potentially, but I don't think so. So
that sounds like a step too far. Canet and Navarro both finishing. That sounds way too far.
Yeah, that's true. Actually, you probably should mention Canet in a little bit, because people were convinced that it was his race to lose today, and it was a mediocre one, definitely. But yeah, obviously the Bosco Scuro is working really well. Lopez just judged it perfectly. Obviously, I may as well mention Canet because we were just on about him. Obviously, Canet started on pole, went backwards, fought his way back through, overtook Lopez, took the lead, but then Lopez didn't get flustered, didn't do what we've seen Lopez do last season, which was dive bomb immediately back up the inside and just wipe them out, as he did to Lowe's and to Dixon last year, and Acosta, I think. I don't think he knocked Acosta off, but he definitely rammed him wide, and a few other riders made himself a bit of a nuisance. Kept it sort of tidy, ran the same pace as him, and then just overtook him again when the time came. Manu Gonzalez was up there a bit again, battled with him, moves were all pretty clean. So, yeah, can't really fault at all the race of Alonso Lopez, frankly. It was a very, very good one. Like I said, he pretty much defended perfectly. You can't really get much more of a textbook definition. Maybe if it was a different rider behind, someone a bit less experienced, because at the end of the day, let's obviously Ballas never been on the podium before, right? That's going to mean a lot to him, whereas if it was Aaron Canet, if it's finishing second again or send it up the inside, I know which one he's going to go for. So, yeah, it is one of those things. Or a rider that's, won races before. Like if it's Aldeguer or something, he's sending it up the inside. So, yeah, maybe that also plays a part into it, though. He would know that. Lopez would know Baltas is not usually up in these positions. So Baltas is going to be nervous, and Baltas maybe isn't going to do something silly because he'd rather finish second than crash trying to win, which is not the case for everybody. So, yeah, overall, can't fault Lopez this weekend. He qualified well as well. And, maybe it's kind of starting the season off on a good foot, and maybe we'll start to see the performances we kind of saw from him in 2022.
Yeah, again, Lopez, very, very strong today. You did mention Canet there, and I was thinking, again, probably after, in hindsight, no, I might have been wrong, but I'm still going to make the point just in case, just because I still think it holds a bit of water. We saw him basically crash so much over the last couple of years, and he's always kind of, to be fair, Moto 2 was always a bit of a crash fest, and you always feel like it was just the Dunlop tyres. Again, great durability in terms of performance, and feel probably not amazing. So now that we have something that, in terms of the whole construction of the Pirelli tyres, completely different to what was there previous, so it's a lot more rider feel. You can use more tyre, as well as higher overall kind of grip levels and faster lap times throughout races. Obviously it dies off as they wear, but it gives a different dynamic. Now, is it maybe just like Canet now? Again, obviously he's been quick a lot on the Dunlops, but the fact that got pole, alright, made a ball to the start, went backwards, but then he came through so quick. Now obviously he ended up using far too much tyre, but I was thinking as he was coming through, I was like, maybe the Pirelli's is exactly what he needed, that he just needed that sort of a tyre just to give that sort of feeling, and maybe he probably will get his first win with these tyres, because I just feel like that I've always felt like that he's had the speed, but to do that speed, he's over his limit with the bike, and a front end slide is going to catch him. We saw in I think 2 years ago in Texas, Vietti got a gust of wind that blew him out, and about 6 laps later, Cannon had a convincing lead and managed to throw it away there as well. So yeah, you never could trust Cannon on the Dunlop. So maybe now that we're going to Pirelli's a bit more rider feel, he might have overall a better chance of finally breaking that duck of not winning in Moto 2. So I'm going to start the GP section off with the sprint now. Martin took pole. Again, there's no question on his day, Martin is probably the quickest man over one lap in the class. Obviously topped off with the GP24 underneath. He wins the sprint, doesn't look too happy in Parc Ferme, and says that was the limit. And again, throughout the race in the sprint, it didn't look like the speed or the outright pace was that hot. It looked like everyone was kind of just holding back. We saw Aleix come through. Were you kind of surprised how underwhelming Martin was in the kind of Parc Ferme celebrations and his kind of interview after the race, after pole to the sprint win?
Yeah, I was, because it kind of looked from an outside standpoint. They had it, not convincingly, because Binder was pretty close to him, but not something he hadn't done last year, sort of defending from Binder. Thailand comes to mind. It's kind of the race he had Binder behind him the whole time. But yeah, it looked like he sort of found something. He struggled a little bit in the test. He still had the lap time, but he was struggling with the chatter, which obviously was something that afflicted him, obviously in the main race probably a bit more. But yeah, he wasn't happy because the bike had been sort of chattering so much throughout the whole race. So yeah, I don't think he was... It was one of those things where he'd managed to pull out a win, and he probably felt like, I did good to do that, but there's a problem here, and I'd rather get it sorted than focus on the win. Because also at the same time, he would know as much as we do from last year that he's better at the sprint races than Bagnaia is. It's just a fact. Like he wins the sprints much more often than Bagnaia does, and then performs slightly worse on the Sunday. So I think he was thinking if he's struggling that much, or he had a massive issue in the sprint, he's like, this is going to be a problem tomorrow. So we need to get this sorted. And he probably wanted to focus more on that. So yeah, I was surprised to see it, but it kind of makes sense when you figure out the context around it. It looked like he had won the race pretty convincingly, but obviously he was struggling quite a lot throughout, which seems to be a bit of a thing for him at Qatar, because I think he won the Qatar sprint race last season, didn't he, and then struggled a lot, obviously. Well, he had the nightmare, didn't he, in the main race. So Martin, very good at a sprint, so I suppose winning one for him is not particularly unheard of, so he probably wasn't super happy when he does that. Like, he's not like thinking, yes, I've really got it this weekend, because he probably thinks if he hasn't won the sprint by more, then maybe he's struggling, and he had this issue. So yeah, I was surprised to see him struggling. Not struggling. Well, I was surprised to see him struggling, I guess. I was surprised to hear that he was struggling so much when he made it look so easy, but it makes sense that he wasn't super thrilled, because obviously he had a pretty severe issue with the bike.
Yeah, we've seen Martin before win these sprints and do exactly. He just dominates the sprint. He just puts in lap after lap, and nobody can kind of do them qualifying S laps in a row like that. So the fact that Binder probably kept him so honest, obviously Pecco was struggling. Aleix, given another 3-4 laps, might have been able to push him for the win in the sprint as well. So again, probably hindsight, it does look like there was issues there for Martin and his GP24. But again, I think he still needs to take some solace that even though he had big chatter, he had just not the greatest feeling, he still managed to get it. He's at that point where even though everything wasn't right, he still managed to win the sprint, and it wasn't the last lap lunge. He still led kind of convincingly start to finish, and kind of there wasn't really any opportunity for anyone to beat him really, so it was still kind of comfortable in a way, maybe not as comfortable as he'd like obviously, but nonetheless it was still a good start to his weekend. Now unfortunately, then we get to the main race, and we have our second false start of the weekend. Now, again, we touched on this in Moto 3, and I mentioned that maybe if a rider is a bit more of a mechanical, it's probably safest to pull him off the grid. Now, second race out of 3 to have an issue today, and again, it looked like Race Direction seemed to just handle this so much more kind of efficiently, and they got everyone back off the bikes turned off. And it kind of turned out really that Raul Fernandez must have had a bike issue, because he goes into the pits to start from the pit lane. Then they say he can start from the back of the grid. He just needs to start the warm-up lap from pit lane, and then goes and jumps on his second bike, which he later on, I think about 7 laps to go, ends up putting into the pit. So Did you think, Rhys, that it just looked a lot more slick the second time around when the whole fall starts procedure just looked a bit more convincing?
Actually, I think the opposite, to be honest.
Really?
I thought that they dealt with the Munoz one better because they were a bit more like, yeah, come on, you get you off the grid. Whereas they came and ran out, he kind of waved them off, they ran back in, and then came out again to tell him, oh, no, you really do have to get off. So it's kind of like, with Munoz, they kind of stayed there and, you know, made sure you, get off the track kind of thing. Whereas I feel like they kind of ran back in. I thought they were just going to let it go in MotoGP, but then obviously maybe they had to then run to say, no, look, abandon start and get them to. They then obviously did the start procedure, but I feel like that's not better managed. That's worse for me because it was more like they actually had more of a disruption to the race start, whereas with the Munoz, I suppose they just sort of whacked him off, sent him around again, and just sent him off. Whereas obviously with MotoGP, it's like, oh well, this guy was refusing, but we have now dragged him off the grid. But now everyone else needs to turn off their bikes, put the tyre warmers back on, stand around for 10 minutes for some reason, and then go. So I actually think that's worse. And obviously then shorten the race distance by a lap. So it actually affected the race distance. The riders had to sit there for longer. They had to bring all the mechanics and warmers back out. Whereas with Moto3, they've dragged them off the grid and they started the race kind of thing. So yeah, it's for me was actually probably dealt with worse. They should have just forced him off the grid like they did with Munoz. It's probably harder because the bike's heavier, I guess. But for a rider to just push the bike off themselves. But even still, I actually disagree on that one. But again, it's another rider that's obviously they know the rules. They know that if they stall the bike and then the race has to get stopped, the start procedure has to be sort of halted, they have to start for the pit lane. I know I was saying disagree with it earlier, but you made a good point by if you've got a mechanical, it may happen again as the race starts and you might get hit. So actually that kind of does explain quite well why you have to get off the track to me, actually. So fair enough. I kind of have a slightly different standpoint than I did earlier in the podcast because I hadn't thought of it that way. But they know the rules. Again, a rider chose to ignore them, which I think in itself is a problem because clearly they don't respect the stewarding enough to just listen to them. And maybe, okay, your penalty is then to start from the pit lane, but then you maybe should also have a penalty because then it's like you may as well try and ignore them because on the off chance they let you get away with it, you've gained something. Whereas if you ignore them, then eventually they pull you in. You've got the same penalty. And also inconsistent because they sent them around another warm-up lap and allowed Raul to start from the back of the grid, whereas Munoz had to start from the pit lane. So again, a slight discrepancy in the stewarding. And I think more my point is, if you've ignored the stewards deliberately, you should then get the penalty. Obviously, you've got to start from the pits because you stalled, but also here's a penalty for the next race, a long lap, because you ignored the stewards when you were supposed to listen to them. Whereas it just encourages them to ignore them, because if there's no extra penalty for that, then you may as well try and ignore them, because if they let you get away with it, you start in your starting position. So, yeah, overall, I actually think it was handled worse, and also think that they need to change it. If that's the rule, then you need to penalise them for ignoring the stewards, ignoring the race direction as well. It needs to be an additional penalty on top.
Yeah, I definitely agree. If riders are waving at the stewards after somehow preventing the race from starting, if they don't straight away comply by either pushing the bike off, riding it off if they manage to bump start it or whatever, there should be a fairly strict penalty, because at the end of the day, the stewarding and the race direction it has to cause a shot, really. Like, so if you're for whatever reason disobeying them or trying to argue with them on the grid when everyone is ready to go, that's straight away, that should be a very strict penalty of maybe back in the grid for the next race or a double long lap. It should be something that is like, that's a no, that's something you just do not do. Like, so again, the fact we saw Munoz throwing his hands up, and again Fernandez kind of just pointing at the bike saying he got it started, but in the end it was the right decision, because clearly he had an issue with that bike because he ends up running on a second bike. So it was probably the right thing to do. Again, maybe go get the whole thing. I feel like maybe the GP bikes are a bit more sensitive to tire temperatures going down, as well as they get hotter probably quicker, so they probably have a limited time they can hold them there, whereas with the Moto3 are probably a bit more, they probably are a bit more lenient to where they can hold them a bit longer without affecting the start sequence. So yeah, I did feel it's alright though. In fairness, the delay was a bit long. Surely maybe again they were starting out everything with Road Fernandez and stuff, but I still felt it was on quite a bit before we got the restart. And again, you make a solid point with the discrepancy of penalty, because the exact same incident happens twice and two riders have two completely different penalties, and they literally do the exact same thing. The bike, for whatever reason, as they get ready for the light sequences, isn't running, has stalled. They both get it going, and they both refuse to get off the grid, and then one of them has to start in the pits, the other one has to go to the back of the grid. So questions there really is just, again, first podcast of season 3, and we're already kind of questioning the consistency of the stewards, and we haven't even made it to the end of the podcast, which is great. But We're going to move swiftly now to the European manufacturers of Aprilia out of Noale in Italy. And KTMs, they do not look far away really. Pre-season, the GP24 was looking like kind of a RC 211V kind of domination, where it looked like it had everything covered. But again, I know we've mentioned it in all the other categories, I'm going to say it again, Qatar is the outlier, but the Aprilia in the sprint definitely, maybe not over the full race, and the KTM in both, in Jack's hand, and probably Pedro's as well, to be fair, looked, not Jack, look, in Brad's, Jesus,
I was about to say, I don't think it looked good in Jack's hands.
No, it wasn't in Jack's hands for long enough, to be fair to poor Jack. Brad looked very good on both, and again, like I said, Pedro strong on both, so it looks like the Aprilia, maybe not as strong as the KTM, but they're not as far away as I was slightly fearing coming into the season. What do you think about it?
The KTM has definitely taken a step. It was, I mean, we saw a few races last year. We saw Binder really was the guy that kind of took it to the KTM, not to the KTMs, he's on the KTM, to the Ducatis, you know, at some tracks. But then there were some non-Ducati wins that weren't him, but he was there most weeks, whereas now I think it looks like he'll be there. Well, I don't want to take too much from Qatar, because remember, Paul Espargaro leading for ages, and then Binder finishing second in that race at Qatar a couple of years ago, and Bastianini won. And that didn't exactly, you know, the Honda was not leading any more races after that, and Binder wasn't finishing second really after that either. So it is a bit of an outlier. Obviously a track that probably works quite well for Binder, even though the KTM had some rough races there in the past. They've also had some pretty good ones, so it's not worth reading into too much maybe. But off the form of that, I'd say he definitely looks closer. He was able to actually overtake a few times, which was not something he really could do last year. He just gets stuck behind Ducati. It looked very much like that in the sprint race. Again, he couldn't pass Martin, but then in the main race, he was able to pass Martin on a number of occasions, which is probably something we'll come back to, because I think those two cost each other way too much race time by going at it too much. But yeah, the KTM definitely looks a lot closer. We saw Acosta was looking really good on it as well, over testing, but then also in the race weekend. Acosta was obviously looking really good over testing. The others weren't so much, but that's pretty standard for KTM. Their pre-seasons are never that great. Binder gets to the track, he does the business, so fair play to him. He was up there, and you know there was no way he could exceed the trial limits this time because they had these new curbs, so he didn't lose a podium because of it. So yeah, I think the KTM's closer. The Aprilia looks to be about the same to me, and the Aprilia is interesting, right? Because it's so inconsistent. It's always so inconsistent. I mean, we were sort of saying, I think, before the podcast, you know, Aprilia is like the most unreliable bike as well, because it breaks down so often. Like the amount of times you see an Aprilia pulling into the pits, right? You never see a KTM, you never see a Ducati, you never see a Yamaha, even though there's two of them. You never see a Honda really pulling in the pits, unless a Honda, I guess, you see it pulling in the pits after it's been up the road a couple of times and the guys decided to pull in. But the Aprilia, every few rounds, one of the 4 Aprilia riders will retire for some reason. They'll have some sort of fault, they'll have an electrical problem. The bike is cooking them alive. The bike's run out of fuel. Went into the wrong mode. They put the wrong tyres on it. You know, these kind of things, like where they pull into the pits, it happens a lot for the Aprilia. But then also, it's unreliable in terms of it's just from track to track. I mean, we saw in the pre-season, Ralph Fernandez was looking amazing. His bike fails to start for this one. He has to start for the back of the grid, makes a little progress through the pack, and then retires again. So clearly there's issues with his bike, even though it was looking good all weekend. And it didn't really work out for him in the sprint race either. Oliveira hasn't really looked great on this bike at all. Obviously doesn't like it that much. Vinales can be similarly said, doesn't look that good on this bike, doesn't really like it. Aleix, stunning in the sprint race. Looked like he had so much more grip after 11 laps, which, you know, is half race distance. So you're saying second half of the race, the bike's looking great. Looking like he's going to be really fast. He's going to be past the Ducatis. Basically drove past Pecco at one point, which does not happen when you're on an Aprilia versus a Ducati. Come race day, rubbish start, doesn't really do anything, finishes right in front of Vinales. So he was at the end, he ended up nearest. I think he was a few seconds up the road from Vinales, in fairness, but the positions were next to each other. And ultimately, at the end of the day, that's what's important, the points at the end of the season. And we've seen how many seasons those two have been very close in terms of points, even though it always looks like Aleix is going to be the one that does better. Vinales is a bit more. I think Vinales were more consistent over the season. He's kind of nowhere for most of the season, whereas Aleix wins the odd race and then crashes out of a few and balances it out against Maverick. But the bike looks the same to me, pretty much in terms, not physically, obviously it looks quite different, but it looks like sometimes it just works really well, sometimes it's nowhere. And that's pretty much the only bike that's just be like that, because like the Honda's nowhere every week, the Yamaha's nowhere every week. The KTM was a bit like that last season, but it was always pretty decent. It was either like fighting at the front or just not quite having the pace of the Ducatis, whereas the Aprilia was like fighting the Ducatis or like fighting the Yamahas, you know what I mean? It's to me, KTM looks closer, Aprilia looks about the same distance behind, to be honest. And I think on its day, we'll beat the Ducatis, and when it's having an off day, you know, it'll be battling Fabio Quartararo for 11th like it was today. So, yeah, it's just more of the same from Aprilia, to be honest.
The gap across the line between Aleix in P8 and Maverick in P10 was 1.9 seconds.
There you go.
11.2 for Aleix off of Pecco.
How far was he off in the sprint, do you know? I'm pretty sure it was less than that by a significant amount.
It would have been about 3 seconds. I don't actually have that in front of me. I only have the actual race in front of us.
Well, behind Pecco was about like minus point. Like.
Well, yeah. Sorry, to the winner is
so,
what I meant. So.
Yeah, I meant to the winner, but I was just thinking, yeah. So
yeah,
it does kind of just say, doesn't it, that again, I mean, even from day to day, it's not the same. I mean, how is it going to be consistently up there from race to race if it can't even? Because like if it can't have a tyre advantage one day and then the same tyres be used the next day and not have an advantage, it doesn't make any sense. Like I just don't know. And I think a lot of it has to do with the riders on the bike, quite frankly. None of the riders that are on the bike have ever been very consistent. They've been great some races and nowhere the others, and you can say that for all four of them. Which just, well, I mean, you can say that I guess Fernandez isn't really anywhere most of the time, but yeah, it's just Aprilia just don't seem to have it.
Aprilia are the Ferrari of GP. They're just sometimes good, sometimes not so good. They share the Italian language, and they probably make the best looking bike, and there's a lot of positives, and the kind of drillness of it just isn't there. They just aren't well drilled in terms of procedures, and it's just a bit messy. And again, on its day, the outright speed at Aprilia is amazing. It just doesn't really have it everywhere else when you need it, so it's a bit of a shame. But since we've covered the other two, I'm going to just throw a curveball. Did Yamaha and Honda come to Qatar? I don't remember seeing any of them.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I think we knew this was going to happen, right? Just because
not as bad as this.
Yeah. Well, they weren't any worse than they were last year, though. That's the thing. They were quicker than they were last year as well, in fairness to them. It's just the other bikes are also faster. I mean, even the bikes that came to this track last year were quicker than they were last year. They weren't, I mean, they weren't really much further off than they were last year. I mean, the Honda, actually, I'd argue, is better because the riders didn't crash.
Yeah.
It's clearly more rideable. I mean, we saw Jaromir battling somebody today. That's the first time we've seen him not in the gravel, like, for a whole season. Like, and that's not even a joke. Like, you'd see Mir was last, and then you'd see 3 laps later Mir has crashed, and it's like Mir is trying his hardest and he's in last place, whereas today and yesterday he was fighting just outside the top 10 and was staying on the bike, which I think that's a step. The Yamaha is just much of the same, to be honest. Just riding around just outside the top 10, basically. Fighting bikes it shouldn't be. Shouldn't be fighting a VR46 Ducati, let's be honest. Shouldn't be fighting an Aprilia either, but Fabio drags it to some places that it shouldn't be. Again, it was kind of nice to see the finishing positions of the Yamahas were somewhat close, I guess, but then maybe that just says more about the maximum. But they've been given these concessions, but the concessions were never going to make a difference over winter because everyone had the same tools available at that point. We won't see it improve until over the course of the season, so I don't think it's fair to say, oh, they've made no progress from round one, because they haven't had their advantage kick in yet, if that makes any sense. Like, from now, they can test more, they can bring new engines, and whether they choose to use the concessions properly or not, I don't know, because previously they haven't used what they have had available. But at least the Honda, definitely you can point and say there's been an improvement because it's clearly more rideable. Even if that means maybe the bike's slightly slower, which I don't think it is either, unless you're Luca Marini, which case it's not even, yeah. But like, it's definitely better because they're staying on it. And I know that's a kind of a silly point to make, but you don't get points if you crash out of every race. You don't get points if your riders are constantly injured and Ika Lecuona ends up doing more rounds than Alex Rins. Like, it's not, and he keeps having to swap between World Superbikes and MotoGP constantly. Doesn't help anybody out. Bradl has to get pulled out every so often and stuff like that. So, yeah, I think there's you can see progress there at least. They were slow. They were kind of nowhere, but it's to be expected at this point. So, we'll see. I think it's too early to judge and say that they're worse than last year because I think it's clear that they're either the same or better. I don't think they're worse. They've definitely made a step. Whether the others have made a step as well, I think that's separate. But I think we'll have to see, especially when we get to maybe Europe, we'll have to see maybe if there's a bit more of a difference, whether they can, maybe they have a few days testing at Assen or something, and then when they get to Assen, you'll see them improve. That's what I'd do if I was in charge of Yamaha's testing programs. Like, what race are we going to do well at? Assen's our one shot. Right, let's go and do like 20 days of testing at Assen, get the dialed in setup, and turn up and actually win a race or something. But yeah, I think it's too soon to tell about Honda and Yamaha at the moment.
Too soon to tell, you say, so I'm going to throw you another question and your answer probably will be the same. Will Fabio still be riding Yamaha next year?
To be honest, that depends more on what happens with other people than himself, honestly. If it doesn't improve, then maybe not. I think he clearly has a bit more belief in the team, but then that's also because he doesn't really have anywhere else to go. Depends. If Aleix stays in MotoGP, then there's a seat there that's not free. I think that's quite a linchpin because it's one of those things where it's a good seat. I know I was just basically spent like 5 minutes just like dissing Aprilia, but as we saw in the sprint, you could get a podium on that bike, and with somebody a bit better on it, maybe we could get more consistency out of it. So, and even still, I was saying, yeah, it wasn't that great, but they still beat the Yamaha, so it's not any worse, even when they're not really anywhere on the factory bike. So that's a seat that's potentially for him. There is a second Pramac seat, which is going to be free at the end of the season, let's face it. And that could go to Fermin Aldeguer. Had a pretty bad race today, so, maybe he needs to stay in Moto2 another season. There's a potential there. Fabio Quartararo could go there. I think depends how good Marquez does as well this year. He can see that you can go from a factory bike that's struggling to a satellite bike and do pretty well. So that's maybe an option. I know Martin is kind of thinking about maybe leaving Ducati because he can see there's not a path to him for to the factory bike. So maybe he releases a Pramac seat. So it depends what seats are available at the time. If there's no Ducatis or Aprilias available, then yes, you'll stay at Yamaha because he's not going to go to Honda. Because also there's not any seats available there really. So yeah, I think it definitely depends on how much progress the bike makes, but it also just depends how the rider market shakes out. What's free? Marquez, has been heavily rumoured to be leaving Gresini at the end of this year, really, to try and go to a factory team or try and maybe go to another manufacturer or something. So that might open up a seat there. So it just depends. It really does depend on what other riders do. I think more than Fabio. Fabio hasn't. Obviously, don't get me wrong. Manufacturers will be biting his hand off to sign him because it's very clear how good he is. But if the seats aren't available, the seats aren't available at the end of the day. It's like Marquez last year moved to Gresini was because Digi underperformed. If Digi didn't underperform, there's not really a seat for Marquez. So it heavily depends on other riders and what contracts they sign.
Interesting. Right, we're going to move to one of the biggest superstars in the world of motorsport currently, Pedro Costa. Very fast pre-season, very fast in Friday and Saturday. Had a really interesting sprint, said he learned a lot. His main race was probably a race of two halves, you could say. At one point was in and around the podium spots, ends up... Does it disappoint, would you say, P9 disappointing? 11.5 seconds off? Or is that just he had to get that kind of race out of a system where he needs to kind of go out there, shred a tire, go, right, that's not going to work. I'm going to have to rethink this.
I don't think it's disappointing at all because the sprint was pretty good. What was it, P8 in the sprint?
Yeah, I think so.
He was pretty close to the win, 4 seconds off the win, which is amazing after half a race. Considering that his first lap wasn't great because he couldn't get the ride-out device disengaged, I think it's turn one, the start device, the front one. And also it was his first time battling the MotoGP bike with the aero. And I think he said that the first few laps he couldn't understand what was going on because of the wake and stuff. So that was a massive learning experience for him. And then yesterday he overcooked his tyre. Obviously, he was probably was stretching a little bit. He could see the podium on the horizon, and you can't blame a guy for going for it in his first race, trying to go for the podium. He doesn't know what the tyre is going to be like, so it's better to push it because then he knows how much you can push. So you're going to have to learn this at some point. We saw Martin do this last year, and he's been in MotoGP for quite a while. So it's not particularly a bad mistake to make. And he still finished, ninth? Even after that, he destroyed his tyre with 7 laps to go, and he still managed to hang on and keep some of the riders behind him that definitely should have got past him a bit easier. He stayed on. That's a good thing. How many rookies have we seen looking promising and crashing? Zarco pops to mind, leading the race by quite a way and crashing out. That could have been his first GP win right there. Would have been much quicker than... I think his career would have taken a very different turn if he didn't crash out of that race. But that's kind of unrelated. But Acosta destroyed his teammate, right? Absolutely destroyed him. Where was Augusto? P17 or something. He was nowhere, yep. Right? He was absolutely nowhere. Even with Acosta making a huge mistake with the tyre, still finished solidly in the top 10. Jack Miller crashed, and I don't know where he finished exactly. He got back on, didn't he? I think he still beat some people, didn't he? Which is...
He ended up coming last, but it was... I think at one point he was ahead.
He was ahead of Marini at one point.
He finished 3/10 behind him, so I'd say maybe a slight bit of damage toward the ends probably just ruined his race for him.
Yeah, probably. But yeah, even still, I don't think it's disappointing at all. He might be maybe disappointed with the result because he was running very well at one point, and perhaps he thinks I should have stayed tucked in behind Mark for longer instead of trying to attack. But, he's got to find these things out at some point. He's made an impression. Clearly, he's shown that he's got the talent. So I don't think it's a disappointment at all. Very happy with how he performed because he was fighting up there with the best riders in MotoGP, past probably the greatest MotoGP rider of all time, Marc Marquez. I said probably, and he overtook him. And you just don't do that as a rookie. You don't overtake a rider of that caliber. And he was closing up to Brad Binder, who is KTM superstar. It's been on a KTM for about 20,000 years. So. And he's just jumped on the bike for the first time. So, yeah, it was a very, very good weekend. And it definitely shows he's going to be getting some podiums. He's going to be winning some races this year, I would say. Martin won one in his first season after a really good performance at Qatar as well. It kind of just showed later on that he was going to be really good. So, yeah, I have no doubt in my mind that he will be featuring in some of these races much more heavily later in the season with the experience he's gained. This would be great experience for him as well because he'll know a bit more about saving the tyre and a bit more about how much you can push a tyre till it's gone. So, yeah, he might be a bit disappointed because he didn't get the end result he wanted, but I think it's still very something to be proud of.
Yeah, and again, Pedro's stock value, his ceiling is just going up, 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 up. It's he had so many slides in FP. He had so many slides in FP1 and 2 and stuff, and it was just the whole bike controller was brilliant. And it's funny.
That was crazy.
It was funny you mentioned there that he overtook Valentino Rossi somehow in the race. That I must have missed that one. But we're going to move swiftly on now to a third-tier Ducati rider, Mr. Marquez, number 93. First weekend in Gresini colours. Rhys, positive weekend overall, you'd say, for 6-time world champ?
I think so. He came into this, this weekend. Well, he came into the season saying that fighting for top fives would be the goal, right? Because some of it's PR bluff. Because look, no one's going to go in saying I'm going to win the championship. I'm going to be all this because you just come across. You don't come across well saying that, even if you really believe that. And I'm sure every rider does. You can't actually say that, right? So for a start, he's never going to say that. But we did think the top 5 thing was maybe a bit underselling it, maybe fighting for the odd podium and maybe a race win or two or something like that. But I think genuinely he didn't know where he stood anymore, because things moved on since he was at the top and winning races consistently. Obviously, he's not really fought properly since he had the injury, for wins and things like that. So I think he didn't know where he was. Also, then coming into this race, he's saying, don't like the track, doesn't do very well, which his record backs that up, because he's only ever won there once, and that was 2014. And that was basically the only year, maybe the first year as well, you could say that he had the best bike on the grid underneath him. It's the only time it's ever happened. And he won the race there. So basically, he managed to beat Pedrosa, I guess. Oh, there was actually Ross he was battling, but I'm saying in terms of beating the other bike that was the same. He had to beat Pedrosa and he managed to do it. But so it's not a good round. It's not a good track for him based on track record. He's won there nearly a couple of times against Dovi, but I'm pretty sure Marquez had Dovi pretty well covered, right? So again, if Dovi was beating him, it was because it was a track where the Ducati was a lot better than the Honda, or like Dovi was just a lot better than Marquez at that track or whatever. So it's not a strong track for him. And 2 top 5 finishes was it? So
P4, P5.
Yeah, P4, P5, and top of the bike he's on, so top GP23, beat his teammate, his brother, who's been on a Ducati for our entire season in both rounds. Although Alex Marquez, fair play to him, had a pretty strong round. So yeah, I think that's pretty much all you could ask for. Plenty within sight of the race leader, which is not something you could say very often the last 2 seasons. You could still see Bagnaia or Martin in the first race. So you could really see Bagnaia in the first one. It was very close to making that a podium. So yeah, I think going into the race, he'll have been thinking he doesn't like the track that much. Had quite a quiet race, didn't do anything too crazy, too impressive, but again, he still learned the bike. I think it's one of those things, a bit like Acosta, he'll just keep getting better, more used to the bike. He was saying in the sprint race, he was riding it a bit like a Honda again. I guess you kind of switch into that mental mindset when you're in a race, like you kind of go into your default settings. So yeah, he probably made it. He made a few mistakes in the sprint, whereas in the main race, it was a bit more consistent, although he did run wide at turn 1 on a couple of occasions, I noticed. But yeah, I think he should be fairly happy with that weekend. He's come away with solid points. He's P4 in the championship as well. Only a few points off the back of, was he like 16 points behind or something like that, which I suppose is quite a bit after one round, but when there's 2 races, it's not that much.
13 points.
So what was it?
13 points. Yeah.
13. So yeah, 13 points, just over 10, pretty much. You win the race and the other guy's 5th, you're basically overtaking him already, which is quite feasible. So, and that's without the sprint. So yeah, he's in a good position, right behind the top 3. Probably going to be those 4 guys going for the championship, isn't it? Really, to be frank, it's going to be going for it week in, week out, pretty much. So yeah, I think going into a round where I think he might be quite good, because he was quite good at Portimao last season, until he obviously wiped everybody out. But if he could track the Honda to a good result there, he can probably do well on the Ducati. And then obviously after that, if he can have a solid weekend, he's got his perfect track of Austin, which I'm pretty sure he'd be targeting a victory at. So yeah, I think it's a good way to start the season, build momentum. 13 points off the championship lead, not too shabby at all, because Martin and Bagnaia will be taking lumps out of each other, so it's not like you're going to have one of them second at every single race behind you. So you can make up bigger swings of points if you start to win a few.
It was an interesting weekend to see him, because it just looks like he's still not 100%, and every chance he gets, really, he's saying that every time he needs to push the bike or needs to try a bit harder, it's the Honda he comes out on, and he keeps going back to that. Again, he was with them for so many years, for all them seasons, that ingrained riding style and what worked for him. He's have to change a small bit. Again, it's just taking that slight edge off. And of course, he's not slow, but he still looks like maybe over race distance just doesn't have. Obviously, again, being on the older bikes will probably plays a small part. And let's not forget Valencia last year, when Digia and Pecco were battling in the last corner. You could just see the difference between the 2 bikes. Again, I'd imagine the gap between 23 and 24 is probably a bit sizable again this season. So there's no doubt that Pecco and Martin definitely have an advantage in equipment. So if Mark is going to challenge for victories or beat these guys in the more conventional races, we all still kind of think that he's going to have an advantage at Sachsenring, Aragon, and then Texas. So if he's going to turn up to Catalunya and beat Pecco 1-on-1 or Martin or win at Mugello, they're the races where if he can perform there, then it's very much so it's his championship in a way. But it's the outlier tracks that we say he's only ever won once at Mugello as well. I think in 14 as well was the only time he ever won there. So it's just a couple
Catalunya he was quite good at, actually.
Yeah, Catalunya, to be fair as well, he was good at, but you still would think like he'll have a bit of a disadvantage against the 24 Ducati. So there's a couple of races there where you think he'll need to maybe show a bit more just to
special.
Yeah, exactly. You'll have to battle and see what happens there. So it's interesting. It still hasn't really answered any questions whether he can win on it. I'd imagine he'll probably be able to win when we go to his tracks. I don't like comparing Rossi and Marquez as much really, but it's very much like Rossi 13 where on the right tracks he can win, but I don't think he's going to be able to win everywhere like he used to be able to. But I think he's still quicker than Rossi was in 13. I don't think he's going to be fourth every week where Rossi was.
I was going to say, I hope he has a better season than Rossi 13, or we won't be seeing much of him.
Yeah, exactly. So I still think that he won't win as much as people are. I think people are bigging up that he's going to do like a doing like 95 season or Rossi 02 or 3 season or his own kind of 19 season. I don't think we're really going to see that. I just don't think you can do that at this moment. I think Pecco is too good, Martin's too good, Binder's too much of a scrapper to let that happen. I think Aleix on his day can prevent it as well. So it's going to be overall tough for Mark, but it's definitely good that he's somewhat competitive. Didn't crash it all weekend, was decent in qualifying, but just shows that he's still not 100% in tune with that Ducati. But moving on from Marky Mark, we're going to move to someone who is very, very much in tune with his GP24. Pecco's perfect plan, is that fair to say?
Well, I mean, if it was perfect, he would have won the sprint as well. But
perfect plan on Sunday?
Yeah, it's very much a continuation of what we saw last year. It's struggles a little bit on the sprint, struggled a bit, but yeah, it's very much reminiscent of what we saw at the end of last season. Really, he struggled most of the weekend. Really, he didn't look like great on Friday. He wasn't amazing on Saturday morning. Probably could have got pole position if it wasn't for the mistake. To be fair, at the penultimate turn in qualifying, but again, he made a mistake, so it kind of shows that he was obviously trying. Then in the sprint, I think some of the media bigged it up a little bit that he was kind of nowhere in the sprint. He was very much there. he was P3. It's not like
P4.
He was nowhere. Oh, P4. Sorry, yeah, P4. He was P3 for most of the race. Dropped to P4 at the end, didn't he? But it was So it wasn't like he was nowhere. He was doing pretty well. But again, he crunches the data with his team, looks at where they were struggling, looks at Martin's data, makes a setup change in the warm. Much happy with that. Turns up on the race day and wins the race. And that is very much what we saw at the end of last season. Martin would win the sprint. They'd look at Martin's data. They'd figure out where Bagnaia was struggling in the race as well, devise a setup change, and go out and do much better on the Sunday, which is where the points are, really. Yes, there is points in the sprint, but there's double points in the main race. So if if you're winning every main race but finishing third in every sprint, you're still going to win the championship. So it is very much what we've seen. We saw it at Assen as well. I remember that one was a very standout one. Bezzecchi had Bagnaia's number in the sprint race quite convincingly. Looked at Bezzecchi's data, which isn't even technically the same bike. It was the previous bike, but looked at Bezzecchi's data, made a setup change, and he had Bezzecchi's number in the main race at Assen, which was crazy because Bezzecchi dominated Assen the year before, or had been very good at Assen the year before, should I say, not dominated it, but looked pretty dominant the entire weekend, and he'd done it. So it's very much a Pecco trait to be better in the main race than the sprint. The only time that's really not been the case was the very, very start of last year, where he was pretty much walking on cloud nine a lot of the weekends, so he'd be really good in the sprint, then would make a silly error in the main race, like crashing out of a wet race at Argentina, or I still can't believe crashing under the pressure of a LCR Honda in Austin. But it's kind of more of what we saw from last year from Bagnaia. Very quick the whole weekend really, but maybe struggling a little bit more Friday, struggling Saturday a little bit as well. Qualifying still somewhat decent anyway, and potentially could have been better. Kind of damage limitation in the sprint, working on way of struggling the sprint and then winning the main race, which is where the points are. So, yeah, pretty much I think you've summed it up there. I know I kind of jested by saying, if it was perfect, he would have won the sprint. But yeah, pretty much his plan
went perfectly for him in the main race, and that's the way he approaches a weekend, because, funnily enough, he knows that winning the sprint is not the be-all and end-all. Score, if you finish third on the sprint, that's the same as finishing like second in a main race in terms of the points lost, perhaps even less. So if you're finishing top 3 in every sprint and then winning every main race, you're going to come out with a lot more points. So yeah, it's just the way to go about winning a championship.
Yeah, I think as well he can win a third title by doing this. He really hasn't changed his we'll say his weekend progression. He kind of uses a sprint as like a bit of a FP4 really, because he gathers so much data. All right, gets a P4, gets a P5, gets a P2, loses points to Martin, but then goes out and just is so much more convincing on Sunday, and still is the Rossi of kind of win on Sunday kind of mentality of build, and then come to Sunday, I am kind of all my boxes covered. I have everything kind of prepared for the race. I know what I'm doing in the race, and again, I just think that it's such a strong aspect of, because again, I doubted him today. I thought he might struggle a bit more in the race. Got a brilliant start, got to the lead into turn 4, and then just did a perfect kind of Lorenzo-esque, really smooth, consistent, control the gap, didn't let anyone really lay a glove on him, and that was that, and that's him leading the championship coming out of Qatar. I think he's made a step again in the off season. I think we probably said that last year as well, that he took the winning of this first title and made a step coming into 23, which was true. Maybe a few silly mistakes, a bit immature mistakes at the start of last year. I could see this season maybe Pecco getting a bit of a lead, just being a bit more consistent, and everyone else kind of building out a bit of a lead, and then maybe through the middle of the season, towards the end of the season, maybe other people come back into it. Maybe Martin figures out, sorts out his chatter issues. Marcus figures out the Ducati kind of syndrome. So there's a lot of it. I think at the moment Pecco needs to maximise the first 5-6 rounds, so that when he gets to the point where Marcus maybe goes on a run with the Ducati, where Jorge Martin hits his purple patch like he did in the kind of middle part of the season last year, or again, you just can't say for certain that there's not an injury going to happen, there's not going to be a weird crash. He crashed out of Le Mans last year with a weird incident with Vinales. Obviously had the high side in Catalunya. So there's always these small things that can happen in Grand Prix racing that you just can't really account for. So I think at the moment he's doing a very good job. He had a brilliant preseason. He's looking very, very calm and very collected, and he just seems to have very good, he's in a good position. So I think he's well on his way to a third world title. Will he get there? It's going to be a long season, but he's definitely set himself up right. So it's a good, if you're in a Pecco fan and in the Ducati camp, you will be very happy with what you saw this weekend, because again, wasn't by any means special in the sprint, did enough, got enough points out of it, got the data, whether it be his own learning from the race, looking at Martins, whatever it may be. The joys of being the number one in the Ducati is you kind of get whatever you need, and that's what was able to get him from P4 in the sprint to P1 in the main race. So yeah, pretty impressive. But as we end off our first podcast of season, we're an hour and 40 minutes roughly into this one. Rhys, going to throw it back to you for the last time in today's podcast. What did you make really of just having GP back? Anything that was surprising? Obviously we've kind of covered pretty much everything in depth, but just your final thoughts really on what was a very interesting opening round to 2024.
Yeah, it was great to see it back, wasn't it? It's one of those things. I mean, like towards the end of like the previous season, it is almost a little bit fatiguing in the way that like it's constant. There's so many races you got to try and remember what's going on in the championship, and it kind of takes it out of you watching that title fight. It's like, you're on your edge of your seat for so long. But after a few weeks without it, you're soon like, right, we need some more of this again, because there's just so many races. But the off season, it's just like the shortest off season like ever or something like that. But it's been, actually might have been shorter the year before, because
this year was the shortest.
This was the shortest. Yeah. Okay. It really is saying something then, but yeah, it was great to see GP back, wasn't it? Obviously, we got a little bit of a taster of a bit of bike action a few weeks ago as well, Superbikes, but. Which was some fantastic racing, but to get all three of these classes, I kind of like some of the stuff around MotoGP a lot as well. Like kind of the little stories that you get of these like rising talents through Moto3 and Moto2, and seeing that. And obviously we've had this whole Pirelli tyre situation. We want to see how that was going to work out. Obviously with Marquez on the Ducati, Acosta making his debut. And I think, to be fair, you know, they've definitely delivered. Acosta was maybe a bit more spectacular to watch than Marquez, but Marquez still delivered there on the weekends by being there. And he had some interesting parts as well. Like he had some moments where he had to properly pull it down to the apex, and that was pretty interesting to watch because it definitely looked like the bike was going to go. But yeah, generally, I don't know about surprises. Maybe probably the biggest surprise is the whole Moto3 KTM not being as dominant as we expected, because everything we'd heard was that they were going to be really good. Well, I mean, they were really good, but everything we heard was that they were going to be a step ahead of Honda, and it doesn't quite seem like maybe that's the case, at least for the top Honda teams. In the Moto2, I suppose Barry Bottas, I guess. That would be my... MotoGP actually played out pretty much how I expected it to. Martin picking up where he left off, winning sprint races, putting on pole position, and Bagnaia winning on race day. As soon as the sprint ended yesterday, I knew Bagnaia was going to win today, so... It was, I wasn't too surprised to see that. So yeah, that's my takeaways. I'll pass the same question back to you. You know, what's it like to have bikes back, and what's your biggest sort of surprise of the weekend, I suppose?
It's brilliant to have bikes back. It was one of those things that was building, and we did have World Superbike, but because of being Australia, I didn't see any of it live, obviously, and none of it recorded properly. So I actually didn't see any of that. I just saw the results, which was a bit of a shame. So that kind of made me more interested in getting back to racing. So having everything back, it's something about this season felt a bit different. I don't know, I can't really put my finger on it. Just watching it today, something just felt slightly different. I'm not really sure why, but it was really good. I think as well, the fact we didn't start in Qatar last year, starting in Portimao was weird. The opening race of season under the floodlights is special to me. It's one of those things I like. It feels wrong if we're not in Qatar for the opening race. So again, and probably in terms of surprises, there's probably not many surprises in GP. I'm probably on the same boat as you. Like, there's probably everything in GP is kind of as I expected. Marquez being quick but not out of his world. The GP24 has been there. Briat being there. Pirelli's being kind of hit or miss. Again, it's all stuff like kind of... Again, even Acosta being so quick isn't a surprise. It's kind of nearly expected, which is probably a bit silly to say, but at the same time probably just shows how much of a talent he is, that he's expected to be doing what he's doing already. Probably the Moto2, the fact the Moto2 race is so different, and the again, Moto3 you can never predict it, so that's always a bit of a surprise what goes on that, but I'd have to put it on the Moto2 kind of being a bit of a different kind of a show and different event. But I think that is where we will leave it now. We will be back once again 2 weeks time for Portimao. It'll be our first day race of the week, and we'll have hopefully some more surprises, and hopefully some of our points that we made in today's podcast might actually look somewhat reasonably okay in 2 weeks time. But from both of us, thank you for listening. We'll see you once again in 2 weeks time from Portugal. Bye for now.